The third line of evidence is a science that we call embryology. So embryology is from the word embryo or embryo. So when an egg is fertilized by a sperm, it becomes a zygote, and the zygote becomes an embryo, right? So during the stages of embryological development of different animals, we see that there are similarities. So, for example, if you observe the embryos of human beings, dogs, cats, fish, turtle, reptile, whatever, we see that there are similarities. So, for example, human embryos. When a human embryo develops, there is a stage where we seem to develop a tail, right? So there seem to be an appendage at the back of at the end of our spinal cord that protrudes, and it is like a tail, right? And but suddenly, if we fast forward it to the development, that tail would actually be suppressed and would just disappear. However, if you look at, for example, fishes and dogs and human beings, if you look at their embryos, you develop their limbs. For the human beings, the limbs obviously become hands and feet, but for the fishes, they become fins. For the dogs, they become the front paws and the legs, right? So if you think about it, it's like we have the same blueprint, or we have the same mold, we have the same blueprint, and then there's just certain differences that happen during the development. So that begs the question: why is that? Why have that mechanism? Why do we develop a certain tail at the start of our development, and then for it just to go away later on? Well, the only logical explanation for it is that all of those organisms have the same lineage. So we actually developed it from the same blueprint. That's why we develop the same structures. But we just do a little bit of differentiation. So again, the front appendages become arms for human beings, but become limbs for horses, or front paws for dogs. So that that is quite a convincing evidence that we have the same machinery, that we developed it, that we have inherited it from the same ancestor. Remember evolution's main tenet: all complex life forms developed from simpler life forms that were their ancestors before they evolved into and diversified into this different species. Okay? Now, the fourth evidence for evolution is what we call biochemistry. So, biochemistry is the study of chemicals, obviously, in the context of biological systems. So, things like DNA, protein. So, and since proteins are the most functional things in a biological system, so this branch specifically looks at DNA sequences and amino acid sequences, right? So, for example, we look at the amino acid sequences in a certain particular protein of human beings, apes, horses, dogs, and other animals. And what do we find out? We found out that the sequence of amino acids are actually quite similar, and the further out you are, the farther you are from the evolutionary tree, the more differences you can find between two organisms. But organisms that are close together in the evolutionary tree, the differences in their amino acid sequences are quite small. So, again, in the traditional story, or to summarize it roughly, evolution says that we started from single cell organisms, which developed into unicellular organisms. Then the unicellular organisms developed into either plants or worm-like organisms, segmented worms. And then the segmented worms became fishes, fish-like organisms. The fish-like organisms became amphibian-like organisms. The amphibian-like organisms became reptile-like organisms. And then the reptile-like organisms became birds. and some branch off and became mammals. Now, and then the mammals became apes, and then apes became human beings. So, if you look at that lineage, apes and human beings are close together in that evolutionary line. But human beings and mammals, such as dogs, are far apart, or human beings and fish. So, what do we see in the DNA sequences or in the amino acid sequences in a particular protein that can be found all throughout this series of number of organisms? We find that the amino acid sequences between human beings and apes are very, very, very closely related, while amino acids between human beings and fish are they have quite a lot of differences, because that is what evolution expects us to find, because of what we have just discussed, the lineage in the evolutionary tree, right? So, you get evidences from fossils, okay. You get evidences from comparative anatomy, okay. You get evidences from embryology, biochemistry, and there's one final evidence that is quite convincing, and that is direct observation. So, direct observation is when you see something really happening in your own lifetime. So, see evolution, for example, the evolution of mammals into apes and apes into human beings, that probably took millions of years, right? And there's no scientific way to observe that kind of long experiment, but we can do that with bacteria. So you see, bacteria can live for just 2 minutes and then die, and then the next generation happens in just 2 minutes, and so on and so forth. So therefore, in a lifetime, in 24 years, you can observe countless generations of bacteria. So that is actually what we have been seeing. If you've noticed, people or medical persons have actually stopped using amoxicillin or penicillin based antibacterial drugs because we have developed resistance to it. I mean, the bacteria that we have in our bodies have developed resistance to it. So what is resistance to bacteria? That is evolution in action. So basically, bacteria are there, and then you have an antibacterial drug. The antibacterial drug kills the bacteria, but if one of the bacteria or one bacterium in that group of bacteria survives, then that means that bacterium has actually evolved and has developed defenses against that antibacterial drug. And that's what we have been seeing nowadays. We have a lot of antibacterial resistance because bacteria have evolved. And that the only explanation for that, for antibacterial resistance, is evolution. If bacteria did not evolve, we would not have a problem like that. Antibacterial resistance. Now, another curious case of direct observation is in the Galapagos Island. So in the Galapagos Island, you have reptiles there that are mainly carnivores, and you have reptiles that are mainly herbivores. Meaning, herbivores mean they eat plants, and then carnivores, they eat meat. Now, there was one scientist, and what he did was he took a group of the carnivore reptiles, and put them in an island which do not have a lot of meat sources in it. So basically, the scientist is forcing the type of lizard to eat plants instead of eating meat. Now, if you don't know, one characteristic of herbivores is this: herbivores have double chambered stomachs so that they can digest cellulose, because you see, plant-based animals have a lot of cellulose, and cellulose is very difficult to digest, even more difficult than meat. So the most common difference between carnivores and herbivores are this: herbivores have double chambered stomachs, while usually a carnivore do not have that kind of structure. Now, the curious result that the scientists found out was this, that when he went back to the area where he left the reptiles some 25 or 50 years ago, I'm not sure about the timeline, but some years, the, the scientists actually observed that the, the modern generations of the species that he left in that island have actually started to develop a small pit just next to their stomach. So it's like they are trying to develop a kind of second chamber for fermentation, which is necessary for you to digest cellulose. So that case, so usually skeptics of evolution, one of their main criticisms of evolution is this: well, evolution takes millions and millions of years, so how do we know that that's true? Maybe they just make this stuff up. I will believe if I see it in my own, with my own eyes. Well, that is the fifth evidence, direct observation. We see it in reptiles in the Galapagos. We see it in antibacterial resistance.